Hello, I'm Ryan Cook, and this is Civic Tech Chat, a show that looks at the way technology, politics, and policy impacts the world around us, the tools we use, the way services are delivered, and how we talk about and set policy all shape our society. We'll gather around and have a chat about these things together and more. Before we get started, I do want to let you all know that we've started a Discord for the podcast. There will be a link with an invite down in the episode description. Do feel free to go check that out. It's a small community right now, but hoping to grow it. It's a great way to reach out to me and let me know things that you might want us to cover, or to just hang out and talk about civic tech. Anyway, let's go ahead and start the show. Jordan, thank you so much for joining us here on Civic Tech Chat. Could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ryan. So I'm Jordan Burris. I'm a Senior Director for Product Market Strategy for Public Sector at Secure. And really, my role there is to help, I would say, evangelize a lot of the concepts related to identity verification, identity overall, and translate that really into insights for government agencies. I worked in the digital trust arena for a little over a decade now at this point, and prior to joining Secure, I actually served in the White House Office of Management and Budget and the Office of the Federal CIO as Chief of Staff, working on all things IT, cybersecurity, and even funding, which was absolutely fun. And so, really for me, the opportunity here at Secure is really to talk about what can be done, better to align government practices with what is emerging out of industry.
Jordan, what would you say is your personal why? That thing that drives you to get out of bed each morning and do what you do?
Yeah, for me, it's really about public service. Ultimately, one thing I often remark, and maybe some members of my team might be getting tired of hearing me say it, is that public servants and those who join civil service, they swear an oath. They raise their hand, they swear an oath, to defend the Constitution, and really for a moment in time, they do everything within their power to try to do what is best for the American public, right? And it's kind of a duty that they've all taken on. Today, in my work, it's really about continuing really what is that career arc and continuing that journey for doing what I can to make government services more secure and accessible for different demographics and user populations. Ultimately, my goal is to work in this arena and try to do what I can to make things a better place for my daughters and their future families. And a lot of it comes down to how we have approached identity historically. Some of the issues and challenges associated with that, opportunities that there are for advancing and changing in particular. And one thing I learned early on in my career, and it's kind of been a thematic, is that identity really serves as kind of the crux or foundation of everything that we end up doing nowadays, whether you're considering physical interactions or even those that are digital. And I saw some of the impacts associated with what happens when you get that wrong. And really that served as a motivator to say that, hey, we can't let those who are victims of identity theft be continued to left out to figure things out for themselves. There has to be a way in which we can try to address this up front. There has to be a way in which we're not unnecessarily blocking folks from access to services. And so, it's really about finding the way to bring, again, that best of breed innovation and what really is a lot of work that's been done across the industry over to support government in what they're doing today. And I'm fortunate to be joined by a number of individuals at Secure who have bought into our mission, right? And our mission overall is to verify 100% of identities in real time and completely eliminate identity fraud for every applicant on the internet. Now, it sounds audacious, but it's something that everyone kind of rallies behind within the company, and it's something we're dead set on helping government solve.
Are there any pieces of media, whether we're talking a podcast, book, video, some other such thing, that you'd recommend to folks that are here listening?
Yeah, within the last year, I came across a podcast, Public Sector Future. It was a little ironic for me because it actually was, I think, one put on by Microsoft in particular, but it takes a different lens to some of the other ones, and it's very much like this particular podcast. It's really talking about what is being done, what challenges are being solved as it relates to digital services to public sector in particular. But it takes it from the lens of international uh, international governments, you hear the voices of public servants or former public servants who were there serving their countries in particular. And so for me, what it does is it helps kind of orient that a lot of the problems, challenges that we're discussing here within the U.S. are not necessarily unique to the U.S. And in some cases, there's a lot of good creative thought that have gone into solving those challenges. So maybe there's lessons learned that we can bring into what would be the U.S.'s approach. And then other things that we should just consider broadly, as the work continues to evolve.
As you've mentioned, I think you talked about this a bit in your personal why. You're a leader in an organization that has a focus on identity, particularly in the digital space. For folks that are maybe hopping into this topic for the first time, can you describe a bit about what we're talking about when we use that term?
Yeah, absolutely. So digital identity is the representation of who you are, your persona, if you will, when operating online, right? We're very much accustomed to what would be kind of that in-person interaction, that handshake. At one point in time, many years ago, it used to be that your identity was surrounded by those who knew you in your community, right? Whether or not your neighbor knew your family, who knew you, etc. And that's just continued to evolve. So when we're talking about identity and digital identity in that context, a lot has changed, and really it is everyone has their own, I'm going to say, breadcrumbs that they leave behind, their digital footprint, if they will, whenever they're accessing technology or they're using services online. And digital identity really represents kind of the amalgamation or the consolidation of all those pieces to really represent how you are uniquely different from others who may be transacting on the internet. And, it becomes an important discussion because when I can't necessarily see you, and I understand that there's a lot that goes on today with video chats in particular, but you have no way of confirming that you are really Ryan or I'm really Jordan behind the computer, other than what we may assert or tell you outwardly, right? And so the practices and the work that goes into verification help provide that that assurance, if you will, that someone is who they are claiming to be ultimately.
Whether we're talking about Ohio with its OHID program, Illinois with their digital ID program, that as far as I can tell didn't have a name that was like an acronym from the state like that, or others. There's plenty of states are trying to work on improving the way that identity interacts with government services using digital technologies. In your experience, how can the implementation of programs like that have an impact on those services?
Yeah, and so there are a number of states, organizations, even companies, right, that are just advancing kind of how they've approached digital identity. I would say that it really comes down to kind of what happens if done right and what happens if done wrong, right? But if done right, you have what would be a seamless, frictionless experience for the end user. They're able to easily get access to whatever it is that they're wanting to do. If done wrong, you have folks that are effectively locked out of the system. There were a number of reports, like over the pandemic, where individuals, were unable to get access to benefits in particular because they could not prove who they were online. That came from a number of factors associated with it, right? And much attributed to some of the legacy ways in which we've approached identity verification and how that's just evolved historically. And in those cases, like, folks had to hire lawyers to come in and basically help vouch for who they are, right? And it's because it wasn't good enough to try to provide some of those in-person or have that in-person handshake, if you will, anymore, right? When we hit the pandemic, a lot of folks were doing things remotely. A lot of things were doing things in different locations, and so it's important. Digital identity programs or those that are really helping to augment what would be that user experience or customer journey become important for enabling really what is that access and understanding that as we continue to move towards what would be a digitally backed economy, that it's paramount that folks are able to engage and transact on via online channels the same way that they would as if they were in person, showing up at a bank, showing up at their local grocery store, etc.
It's interesting you mentioned the pandemic and its effect on like the needs people have for those sorts of interactions. Do you think this kind of pandemic world we've been in has added an urgency for states to try to put investment into the development of programs like these?
Yeah, you know what? The reality is yes. I mean, to just put it shortly, it was yes, it did accelerate a lot of work. And one thing that I observed while I was working within the federal government was that there's a lot of work that's been taking place over the again last decade to try to enhance and innovate and transform the government digital experience. Right when the pandemic hit, it no longer became a thing about prioritization, and because the prioritization was that folks, like, it was a health issue, right? It was a safety issue. You could no longer expect that people would be able to come in person, and then as such, we had to evolve the model, the way of thinking about how to engage with the broader public rapidly and then somewhat overnight, right? And that gave way to a rise in a number of solutions and deployments, et cetera, that had the potential to transform the way in which business was conducted for government. And there's still many lessons that are being learned in terms of what was deployed rapidly, right? And some of these solutions were not meant to scale. They weren't designed really to be used long term. And so there's an opportunity that a number of states and even federal agencies have today to rethink the art of the possible and try to set themselves up for kind of that longer term implementation or journey.
I think something I'm hearing there is there's that old adage, like never waste a good crisis. I'm sensing that
Yep.
maybe there's like an element of that going on in your
Yeah.
answer there.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it was the moment that kind of spurred action across a number of folks. Right, everyone was kind of dead set on what could be done to kind of knock down those roadblocks and barriers. And I remember talking with a number of CIOs back when I was in government, and they basically said that they kind of got carte blanche and the ability to go do the thing that they had wanted to do for the last 5 years or so by their front office. The resources, were given to them in order to execute. And so it definitely was a powerful moment, and then one that they ultimately recognize that they have to continue to evaluate kind of the future impacts of that, right? Because today we still haven't necessarily landed on as a society how we are going to operate. Going forward, right? There's still many debates about whether or not the remote world in which we live in is kind of the new norm, if it is going to be more of a hybrid, whether or not we're all going to have the pendulum swing back the other way, right? A lot of those things are still up for debate, but for the moment, we at least made a lot of progress within the public sector ecosystem in order to transform, remove a lot of those legacy barriers that were holding agencies and organizations back.
With this flurry activity of going on, whether we're talking about things at the state level, programs at the federal level, there's the possibility that we end up with kind of a bunch of disparate systems that may have wildly different standards. Like, what's your take on that possibility and the level of risk it represents?
Well, it's something that was told to me a while ago, that if you've seen one state, you've seen one state. And so I think that really goes to the premise that there isn't really a one size fits all approach when you're looking at how many states have implemented their solutions, and that's really because they're all different, right? The populations, although maybe the population demographics may be similar, the way in which they approach problems, the way in which they have programs set up, they do differ broadly. Some of the risk associated with what happens when you're having multiple solutions being implemented and there's not necessarily a one concise approach or standard that's followed is that you will have a risk of interoperability, right? Especially if you look at the link between federal and state programs, such that you may not be able to exchange data and information the same way. One thing, one particular use case or an example that I can go back to is, I think there's a death master file that is used by the Social Security Administration, and it basically highlights when someone has passed away, so that they know that their Social Security number should relatively not be used anymore. In a number of instances, depending on how a state has implemented that solution, right, it may connect and transact with the Social Security Department, Social Security Administration in a helpful way, or it may be delayed significantly, right? There's also been instances where because of the way data has been submitted, there was an incorrect submission, and folks have had their social security numbers effectively deactivated, and they had to go through this long, arduous process in order to restore what previously there. And I think that ultimately, without that standard or without a similar approach, that guiding principles, if you will, that folks can operate under, you're likely to see again differences in implementation. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's more of making sure that everyone understands kind of or is coming from the same perspective of how you can approach it, right? In some cases, there's a lot of learning that's just needed broadly across the whole industry, in particular across the community U.S. about like what is available out there, what could we do to potentially do things in a similar fashion, and this is no different for us than it is many other countries. Many other countries go through this exact same thing, and at some point there's that light bulb moment where everyone comes behind and they rally towards that central premise of like how they could do this better.
Something that I think is impacted similarly to the interoperability point you brought up is the idea of like securing these like digital identity systems and like how they're implemented. Do you think like I guess as we go, that kind of state and federal policy frameworks are ready to like to provide that guidance for these programs as they get spun up from that like cybersecurity perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, today there's existing guidelines, right? The National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, has put out a kind of a digital identity guideline, if you will, that talks about how identities should be constructed and the process associated with that. To take that a step further, I know that there's been multiple attempts by Congress to introduce legislation by Representative Bill Foster in particular. I think he recently introduced what was the Improving Digital Identity Act of 2021, where, among other things, it would create a framework for digital identity, similar to what we've seen with the cybersecurity framework, the privacy framework, or even the current AI framework that is being debated. And this becomes what is potentially a powerful tool because it could set, if you will, a common way in which everyone could approach digital identity. I've seen countries such as Australia take this type of approach, where they find ways in how you establish an identity, how it transacts, what is the difference between an identity that is established through a financial institution versus one that's established by the government. What roles does everyone have to play within that broader ecosystem? And so I think there's potentially a benefit that may come from that, but I definitely think there's a lot of work that has to be done in order to better shape and make sure that we're really focusing on outcomes associated with these systems or these frameworks as they're pulled together, right? Ensuring that really these are done in a way that is, privacy preserving, ways in which we're continuing to let, users be at the forefront of choice related to that. And then ultimately they get to determine, how their identity and where their identity is used ultimately.
Something I was hearing there at the end of your answer is you're, I think, kind of getting into some of that like privacy elements, like kind of owning how your identity is used, which I guess in a way kind of goes to that like idea of like controlling data about you.
Yep.
Yeah, could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, for me in particular, when we look at identity, where I see trends or where I see kind of the environment going, right, at least for the U.S., right, many other countries have done this differently. There's, those who have the EID or cards or credentials that have been issued to many of their constituents. Estonia is a famous example, even though I think they're probably roughly the size of Rhode Island in terms of user population. But many have approached this different ways. I think for the U.S., we're likely going to see kind of that premise around choice, and that I'm able to originate my identity. There's probably a process of some sort that I would go through, one that may be backed by the government, and one may be facilitated using private industry, where I can more or less do everything I need to do to claim who I am, and then I can take that identity, take the associated credential, or what would be the way in which I authenticate, if you will, and use that across multiple services in particular. So that way you have a definitive, this is absolutely Jordan, or this is absolutely Ryan. I think that, if we look trend-wise, there's definitely more of a desire towards moving that just based on some of the public policy debate. But I'll also tell you that For every group on one side of it, there's also those on the other where there's more of a, hey, let's try to centralize everything. Let's just have someone be the steward, the manager of the account. And that debate is a tale as old as time. It continues to rage on within the U.S. at least, and so I think it's just something that will continue to evolve. But the makings of it are there when you look at things like digital ID wallets, when you look at the ways in which, from at least a payment standpoint, like we're all able to use our smartphones in order to tap, in order to purchase things in particular. Like a lot of that infrastructure is starting to be put in place. It's really the question of whether or not we put it together in a way that really allows user choice and preference ultimately for their IDs.
I think your point about kind of centralized versus decentralized as a conversation that really I guess it sounds like it kind of goes through this entirety of the topic, whether it's about setting policy and frameworks, whether it's about like the technology itself. It's a keen one, especially your point about like, it's like an argument we've been having for a long time. Like, I think that's a definite statement. Like, we've been having this argument since like back in the days of the Federalist Papers, right? It's almost like a key part of our identity to have this argument.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of foundational, I think, to what it is to be an American. Right, we keep debating kind of how we want to approach this topic in particular. But again, I think it's one of those debates that are absolutely necessary, and it makes us better ultimately. I mean, I can tell you that when Real ID I know was being rolled out, there was definitely debates about is the government going too far related to what was being done there, and this was all reaction to, or rather a response, if you will, not reaction, a response to 9/11 and what we saw with basically folks have fake driver's license and were able to board airplanes, right? Like that's the reality of it. So you had to have more scrutiny to it today, and so there's debates about whether or not some things are beneficial or they're not. And I think ultimately the public policy debate or the public debate and discourse that takes place on this issue in particular, I think is an important one because it really helps make the ultimate product or what comes out of it better. Ultimately, and for those who are serving in government or serving in adjacent roles, right, like the role that they have to play in helping to better shape and implement really the outcomes or the outputs of this debate, it can be transformational, right? And as I noted earlier, right, a lot of the work that I'm doing today is not about necessarily fixing everything today, right? It's about setting a stronger foundation such that in the future, the families and individuals have more of a seamless experience or have more of a seamless way in which they can, manage their identity going forward.
Another aspect of this that you and your organization have some focus on is this notion of trying to detect fraud, which is a topic that comes up fairly often in conversations that involve something with the delivery of government services. How significant, from your perspective, is the challenge of trying to go about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, fraud in particular, it's it's like running water almost, right? It's going to find the path of least resistance, and if you look at it from a cybersecurity standpoint previously, or if you look at it from that's really what it is today, right? You have organized criminal rings, you have nation states that are all attempting to pull the wool over individuals' eyes, right? Trying to pretend that they are someone that they are not, and that's either to do things in terms of espionage or to do things in terms of intercepting funds and resources and money in order to basically facilitate their enterprise activities. I can tell you that fraud today is networked, right? They are all collaborating, communicating, using the best tools in order to continue to devise, if you will, plans of attack or different evolve their threat vectors that they're using, and so when it comes to government services, there hasn't historically been a deep recognition, especially because we've been more focused on the in-person interaction and transaction, that fraud was potentially an issue. There's been a number of things that the government has done, and I'll make that abundantly clear. There's efforts on program integrity. There's efforts on payment integrity, whereby we're managing how many payments are made improperly to individuals, and those could be for a litany of reasons. It could be that there was a fat finger on someone's form accidentally. It could be that someone was maliciously doing it in terms of what you would see from a fraud activity, or someone was just straight up lying, which is a different type of fraud that we usually call first party fraud. But when we look at things like third party in particular, that there's a lot that has to evolve in government services if we want to be able to have some type of assurance that someone is who they are claiming to be when they're behind a computer terminal or computer screen in particular, right? Like it is so easy nowadays to pretend to be someone that you're not, especially when you don't have robust fraud controls. And I think that it's definitely something where for me now, I view identity and fraud as kind of interlinked in particular, and how they should be approached and how they should be solved. Ultimately, that two sides of the same coin, and so it's important that as agencies continue to evaluate their strategies, those who are implementing technologies take a lens towards what digital services could be, that there's also a lens towards, okay, how does this necessarily go wrong? Because if you don't get this right, you're hurting more people than you're helping, ultimately, right? And that to me is something any of us who work in public service or in a public service adjacent roles should be striving to help prevent, right? We want to help the most people that we can, and so it's important to ultimately get it right.
I think folks don't often have a full appreciation for that. You mentioned like the kind of like the network threat, the kind of the more organized effort to find those paths of least resistance you talked about, to kind of basically take advantage of them in that way, even to the point of, I think you mentioned like state threat actors even potentially being a thing, like someone just trying to deliver a government service has to think about. Is that something that's like increasingly like more recent spike of a threat, or is this something that's kind of always been there, just not necessarily top of mind for everybody?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been there. It's always been there. It's been traditionally you've seen it play out a lot within financial services. You've seen a lot when it comes to banks, when it comes to things like loans, fintechs in particular, right? A lot of those things are taking place. It's been there within government benefits as well. The difference in kind of what we see today, what's happening with government, is that as we talked about earlier, there was a rapid transformation that took place seemingly overnight. And there wasn't necessarily that benefit of having all those lessons learned implemented right out of the gate that many financial institutions have learned over the years, right? Financial institutions in particular have dedicated fraud teams that just evaluate this issue and work across the organization, to try to refine their practices, their processes, and the tools that are used. Government, while there's definitely pockets where there are hardworking civil servants that are doing what they can on this issue. It hasn't been thought, I would say, as a macro or broad scale, and that's it's just been the challenge of being primarily in-person interaction, paper-based for the longest period of time. And now that there's this drive towards transforming the way in which experience is delivered, whether using more digital channels, there's unintended consequences associated with that, right? Like there's the reality that fraud now is a thing that must be absolutely considered wholeheartedly, especially when you're talking about fraud as it relates to digital channels and what happens when you transact online. When there aren't the right controls or mechanisms in place in order to evaluate that, you get what the headlines were over the course of the pandemic, right? Billions in fraud, millions in fraud go out to who knows at the end of the day, right? There Nigerian fraud rings or other nations, to include China and Russia in particular, right? Like it all becomes more real and center stage for everyone, right? Because it's not something they necessarily had to think about. Whereas, I know financial institutions at least have been, struggling and working through this for a number of years.
As you might be aware, there's something to the notion that adding friction in between, say, like an individual person and a service they're trying to get to makes it less likely that they'll successfully gain access to it. You kind of think at each gate, there's like a non-zero probability that I either like give up or just simply can't satisfy the conditions, even if I should ultimately be entitled to that service, which can kind of lead to policymakers maybe, unintentionally creating incentive systems that kind of create this like trap of actually making, like, say, a service worse by accident or maybe on purpose. I guess it depends on like what they're trying to do with the policy. Are there effective ways in your view to address this sort of concern?
Yeah, and so I mean, to start off with, is that whenever friction starts to get introduced into the conversation, and a lot of it sometimes gets talked about in terms of fraud, and there's kind of this belief in some cases that you need friction in order to combat fraud. And one thing that Secure believes in, and many of the individuals I work with on a regular basis, we know is that access to services does not have to come at the cost of fraud. Like there's ways to manage around this. There's ways to manage around it that doesn't introduce undue friction for participants in particular. A lot of this goes back to some systemic ways in which identity verification is managed. So, to try to take more of a history lesson, I would say there's historically, identity verification has evolved over time. I talked about how there was that in-person kind of memory-based, who you are. In older societies, they used to use jewelry or tattoos or documents in order to help confirm who individuals were. When we look towards more of the modern era, we had kind of the introduction and advent, if you will, of credit bureaus, and what was known as credit header data, which basically helped. It was they were put in place for the purpose of determining whether or not a consumer was good or whether or not they were likely to be a credit risk when you're providing loans or engaging them from a financial structure. But it soon became kind of the de facto way in which we hinged identity for individuals when you couple that with things like trying to get identity documents in particular. And so today what we see when it relates to friction or some of the processes that are rolled out is really a few different ways that are commonly used, right? One is that credit data, that credit reliance or credit header reliance based approach, and where today the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau put out a report a few years ago where they highlighted that it basically introduces bias into the whole process of verifying who someone is. Why? Because over 45 million individuals within the U.S., right? And you look at 20%, up to 20% in particular, are credit invisible, or what they call credit thin file. And this basically means that they just don't have a lot of data associated with them and their transactions. It could be for a number of reasons, right? One, they may not have engaged in the financial institution and construct the way that it was designed to originally. Another could be that they may be newer to country. One could be that they are just young and getting started. And when I was starting out my life, my career, I don't think I got approved for any single loan or credit card that was out there. And a lot of that was due because I needed a cosigner because they just didn't know who I am. Well, when you base your identity systems on that and your processes on that, you're going to have people that effectively get left out. Another approach that is used is what I would say is more of a document-centric approach. And this is where you kind of take that over-reliance on things like your driver's license or your passport, and you say that you must have one of these things in order to engage in society. Well, the problem with that is that there, I think, again, upwards to 10 to 20% of the population does not actually have a driver's license. Now they have some sort of identification documents that may exist, but if it doesn't hit a certain standard, depending on the way an organization may set up something, they're effectively locking those people out. And it makes it harder when you're even considered doing that online. And how do I show you my driver's license, which hasn't necessarily moved into a mobile realm or a digital realm yet? I hold it up in front of a computer screen and try to tell you that I am who I claim to be. You can't tell if that's really a fake, because a lot of our security features implemented as part of it were meant to be physical inspection based, right? And so it's harder really to tell the reals from the fake in particular that way. And another piece on documents is that there are a number of individuals who, because of life circumstances, lose their documents, right? I'm fortunate for me personally that I have, like my social security card or my birth certificate and things like that. People lose those things all the time. And that makes a challenge because not only are you unable to go get what would be your driver's license or passport based on the way that we've constructed some of the rules for getting those documents, but you have a hard time going back and even getting those replacements issued. Right, it becomes a long, arduous process, and so introducing those types of approaches create friction ultimately in the process. And then the third piece would be taking more of what I consider a knowledge-based authentication or knowledge-based verification, depending on how you want to use it, approach. And that's really where you log in and they ask you to submit 3 out-of-wallet questions or 3 questions about your personal history, where if you lived previously, whether or not you've had this type of car or something to that effect, right? Again, a lot of that gets based on the information that's submitted within your consumer report. But then in some cases, like folks just don't remember everything. I think, it was even back as far as 2012. I know Gartner put out a report that said, 10 to 15% of the time folks fail KBV or KBA related questions because they just don't know what was going on. I know today we've seen within Secure upwards of 30%. We've even had a conversation with an agency that said they've seen upwards of 80%. And so, that additional friction doesn't necessarily translate to a better outcome because in some cases the data is out there, right? If you Google enough of an individual or you search on things like the dark web, you can find a lot of things about a lot of people. You can construct fake IDs, you can do a lot of things, and that makes it easier for fraudsters who are highly networked, motivated towards doing these types of attacks at scale, and harder for the constituents or consumers at the end of the day to be able to prove who they are. And so, one way in which we've tried to approach this issue at Secure is taking what really is a data science driven approach, where we are not necessarily taking and evaluating on just one piece of information that might be coming. We're taking a broad, holistic view of an individual as they present themselves online and try to triangulate whether or not they are who they claim to be, and use that through advanced analytics, through machine learning, and a lot of work that's been put in order to just take information that individuals submit, how it's constructed, where it's coming from, where they're maybe sitting, just passively be able to help determine if they are who they claim to be. And that becomes a powerful tool because then what happens is you're not reliant necessarily on one piece of information being right. You're not reliant necessarily on having, even in some cases, all the documents related. You're able to make what is more of a risk-based decision about an individual and an entity ultimately, which better positions you, if you will, for being able to approve them and reduce what they see on their end, right? And then the last thing I'll say on this one is that, at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, is that when you introduce a ton of friction for individuals, you get up to, 50% abandonment rates on digital services. When you try to take a lens of that and how it relates to government, right? Folks are coming to the government in their times of need when they need support, whether that's in trying to help sustain their business, whether it's trying to feed their family for the night, right? When they can't get through the process quickly and they gotta wait weeks to do it, they go look elsewhere, or they lose faith in government, right? They say that public trust or experience with government is at an all-time low. Well, in some cases, it's we have to make our digital services more accessible and easier for people to use, so that way they're not abandoning, they're not feeling frustrated, and they're really able to get what they need, ultimately the things that they're entitled to, being American taxpayers and U.S. citizens.
I think it's a keen observation you made there about kind of how this relates into like that trusting government, which is something we read about all the time. It's it's going down. It's people have less faith in institutions, and yeah, it's a key point because maybe for a lot of people, that one interaction they have with the government is that one time they needed something from it and they're supposed to get it, but that support wasn't there.
Yeah, no, and I have a litany of stories within my family, but I can tell you that even very recently, right, my sister-in-law had to fly back to the U.S. in order to file taxes. She lives overseas. But because she couldn't access the system online, she had to fly back to the U.S., book a plane ticket, come back in person in order to file a paper form in order to access services. Now, she was able to do that, and that's kind of like an extreme worst case of what happens when we get this wrong, right? And it's where I said it becomes more paramount that we really have to think about these things, because otherwise she could have opted not to pay her taxes. But that would have impacted, her family, her son, who is, going to college here in the U.S. Right? There's a number of things that would have taken place there. So it becomes very important that we kind of take that broader perspective of what happens, right, when we're not getting this right.
Oh man, having to hop on a plane, show up with a paper form. I mean, talk about an expensive and arduous filing. Yep. That might be the worst one I've heard so far.
Unfortunately, I have tons of those anecdotes, and my family may get me later, but it's one of those where, the more I hear about it, the more I see, the more I work in this space. One thing that we desire to do here at Secure is really partner and serve as that partner to agencies, really to transform the ways in which they're approaching it. And A number of us are public servants or former public servants, right? And the way in which we approach it, and it's really taking that, how do we best make use of the tools that are available today to better serve the mission of those agencies, right? They got to get benefits out. They got to do what they got to do for the constituents in which they serve, and that just becomes paramount, so that you don't have those negative experiences, those edge use cases where folks are just completely impacted in their day.
In your original answer, you talked a bit about using data science methodologies to kind of look at to try to establish like the holistic picture of a person based on like what's available. Often, I guess in recent times, we've heard a lot about like those techniques being used to try to like automate some decision making processes, which I think there is often a tendency to go, oh, well, a computer made this choice, therefore it's completely free of bias. When it's like, well, there's a human being that has to like come up with this model, that has to like ultimately write the code, and like whatever internal biases they have can be just expressed and made faster through that process. Could you talk a bit about like how one might maybe go about like trying to reduce that risk while still trying to be able to kind of get that the benefits you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, to your point, right? Technology, depending on how it is implemented, absolutely can be biased. I think that ultimately, when it comes to understanding, when you're looking at data science practices, artificial intelligence, machine learning, that generally what you would expect to see or want to see is that you have an organization that is abiding by what I'm going to say, or model development or model governance practices, where they are evaluating really the inputs that they use when building models or helping to train the algorithms that they're using, that they're evaluating the how it's being processed, and they're evaluating the outcomes and outputs associated with it, right? To help make a determination about whether or not it is making the impact that they desire to see, or whether or not there's something that isn't working well for them. I can tell you that when it comes to human decisioning in particular, there's certain things that just in the way we've designed systems today that we've constructed in a flawed manner that makes the area of identity so much harder. So for an example, I talked about how data is used in order to verify who someone is, and all the breadcrumbs associated with who they are online. Well, that may be stored in a number of different ways within a number of different data sources. And so there is no one size fits all, there is no one standard. And what could happen is that as you try to connect things, as you try to do broader data sharing, in particular, you have what is conflict, you have inaccuracies, you have things that are missing, you have some difficulty for computers being able to search just because of the way we've constructed it, ultimately, right? And so in some cases, algorithms can be employed to help with improve accuracy. It's helped improve accuracy as it relates to creating matches, right? Searching through data and doing data querying. How do you what do you do if someone accidentally, sometimes you get those forms where they ask you to put your last name first and your first name last. And me personally, I mess that up all the time, and I have to go back with the whiteout or something like that if I'm doing it on paper and try to correct that. But sometimes people get through the process and they just submit that. Well, that's inputted in a database, and then they can come back in the future and they would think that my name is Burris Jordan and not Jordan Burris. And so there's a lot of issues with that. I think ultimately when it comes down to it is that when you're looking at kind of the bias that may be introduced within the systems, there's absolutely always some bias that is going to exist. It's really about how you are managing the risk associated with that. How strong are your governance practices around that? And then making sure that you become slightly obsessive in removing and mitigating that bias as it is presented or as you identify it in particular. I know one thing that we try to do here is, we one of our values as a company, right, is to be like customer obsessed or be like obsessed on the issue overall. And like we obsess on things just as simple as like a name, right? How names are constructed, depending on how you deploy algorithms in particular for searching against a name, you could have a positive bias towards Anglo-Saxon names and a negative bias towards Asian names with their 3 characters or less. And so like we take that broad view and we say, okay, based on what we're seeing, based on the outcomes, the outputs associated with it, what could we do to basically better design our model, better design our algorithm so we're able to increase coverage, our ability to search across these broad demographics? And then how do we normalize that so that everyone is getting kind of that common experience and you're not having folks that are inadvertently left out? But it takes a focus in being able to really hard charge towards that problem, understand what it is, call it out, and then, do what you can to improve your models ultimately, right? So, I think that, as these things get introduced, what happens far too often is that there's kind of this belief that there can be no bias or that it should be no bias. I think if anything, it should be more approached as a learning opportunity, and that there has to be intent, focus, and dedication to fixing it and resolving whatever you identify, right? That's the only way in which these things get better. Systems improve over time. If I look at the way in which some early algorithms were deployed and the way in which they've evolved now, it was because of this constant evaluation in particular. And I can tell you that there was even an executive order that was put out towards the earlier part of 2021 that talked about kind of the principles for the usage of AI within government. A lot of it was around how are you approaching transparent practices, how are you managing towards outcomes, how are you evaluating it, right? Because and ultimately, these are all tools that we use to help us with our decision making. And to my point about how those who would do us harm, malicious users, fraudsters, their network, they're using the latest and greatest tools. They're using these things to cause problems, right? We need to be using these types of things in order to fight back against them. But it's more about, again, like how do you structure your models in a way, or your process in a way that you learn from what isn't working and make sure that you get it right.
Something I'm hearing in there, and I imagine this is something you play a role with as a leader in an organization, is like you mentioned that like idea of like being like customer obsessed, those sorts of terms. And what I usually hear when folks like talk about that sort of thing is that, hey, like we want to have some sort of like organizational effort to either, you could say it's like, oh, set up incentive systems so that it's like easy to do the right thing. Or maybe like the more business type folks, as opposed to the public policy type folks, might call like culture, right? Mm-hmm. I guess, can you talk a bit about like how do you go about making it easy as like for folks in the organization to like push for the improvements that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately for the culture that's been set up here, right, we all rally around our mission, right, and that is verifying 100% of identities in real time and completely eliminating identity fraud. So our incentive is to do that. And we know that if we do that, it'll be transformational for everyone, right? So as a company, like that is core and central to everything that we do. So from our incentive structure, it's like almost in some cases a challenge of like, hey, we've come across this issue. We've come across this group that isn't basically getting what we think is the best. We have this group that isn't able to approve a number of folks for applications, and they're sending them to long, arduous manual reviews and these terrible processes, right? It becomes this thing of like kind of a battle cry for us all. Like we kind of want to lead the way. We want to show what could be done, what is in the art of possible, and then for us is exciting, right? It's exciting. It's the ability to really set a better foundation ultimately for the way in which these things are practiced. And today we're used widely across financial services, over 1,000 customers today. We even are supporting a number of state governments in particular today with conversations ongoing from a federal standpoint. But I would say but to that point, like a lot of it comes with the opportunity for us to say that we recognize where you are, we recognize the journey that you've been on, the arc that you've been on. There's ways in which we can continue to improve and do better, and we're really here to help partner with you as you go through that journey.
Well, Jordan, thank you so much for coming on Civic Tech Chat to have this conversation about digital identity, services delivery, and those spaces where these things interact with each other. I've no doubt that folks in the audience will have learned some interesting nuggets to kind of take into their thoughts as they go through the rest of their day.
Ryan, thank you so much for having me today. It's been a pleasure.
You can follow us on Twitter using the handle @CivicTechChat. Visit us on the web at civictech.chat, or subscribe to us for content updates wherever it is you download your podcasts.